Hello and welcome to the mains question discussion. And today we will take up a question which was asked in the mains examination of 2019 under the General Studies paper 1. And this question was related to coral reefs. Now this topic of coral reef has been asked in the geography part of the General Studies paper 1. And the question reads, assess the impact of global warming on the coral life system with examples. So in this discussion, first we will try to look at the way in which this topic of coral reef or the coral bleaching was covered in the DNS, in the Focus magazine and in the mains compass of 2019. And after that, we will take up the discussion for this question as to how you could have approached this question. Now the important terms in this question are the impact of global warming, and this impact of global warming has to be highlighted on the coral life systems. Now we know that the main impact of global warming on the coral life systems is that majority of coral reefs are facing the problem of coral bleaching. So in answering this question, you had to establish this relationship between the impact of global warming on the coral life systems, and that too with examples of coral bleaching that are happening across the world. Now this impact of global warming on the coral reefs was covered in various DNS videos, and in these DNS videos some of the important researches which happened on coral reefs have been discussed, and that is mainly because such articles were in news in the past 1 year. For example, in the DNS of 4th November 2018, it had an article related to robust corals, and these robust corals have a unique characteristic because they are able to produce their own amino acids, and that is why they are less vulnerable to the impact of global warming. And this was highlighted by a study which was published in the Genome Biology. So in this DNS video, it was discussed as to what is the importance of amino acids for coral reefs, how do the coral reefs get these amino acids, and also what is the likely impact of global warming on these coral reefs. So in this article, it has been highlighted that amino acids are the basic building blocks of coral reefs. And this is mainly because these are important for growth and repair of tissues of the coral reefs. Now, coral reefs on their own do not produce these amino acids which are required for their growth and repair. However, these coral reefs are in a symbiotic association or symbiotic relationship with an algae known as zooxanthelle. And this zooxanthelle algae provides or supplies important amino acids to the coral reefs. And that is how this symbiotic relationship is important for the survival of coral reefs. However, due to the global warming, the death of these zooxanthelle algae is caused. And that leads to loss of color in the corals. And that is what is known as coral bleaching. Now we know that the zooxanthelle algae is important for growth and repair of tissues of the coral reefs. And due to global warming, as this algae is dying, the survival of the coral reef itself is under threat. And the major impact of global warming is the death of this zooxanthelle algae, which lives in a symbiotic relation with the corals. Now the color of the coral reefs is mainly due to the presence of this algae, which is the zooxanthelle. And if this zooxanthelle algae starts dying, the color of the coral reefs is lost. And that is what is popularly known as coral bleaching. Now what this news highlighted was the robust corals which produce their own amino acids and were not dependent upon the zooxanthelle algae for the production of amino acids which are important for the growth and repair of the tissues of the corals. And that is why these robust corals can survive even in the impact of global warming, and which was highlighted in this news article. So some of the points that were mentioned in this DNS could have been used in answering your question that appeared in the mains examination of 2019. Now another important study related to the coral reefs was in news last year, and this study provided that the coral reefs can survive the events of global warming. And this aspect was covered in the DNS of 14th August 2018. And even in this video, we provided the importance of the symbiotic relationship between the zooxanthellae algae and the corals. And in this video, it was highlighted that this symbiotic relationship between the algae and the corals has enabled them to survive the episodes of climate change in the geological past. Now, as we have learned that due to the global warming, this symbiotic relationship between the algae and the corals is disrupted. And that is mainly because of the death of the zooxanthellae algae because of global warming. So that was the first part of the question. However, the second part required us to answer this question with suitable examples. So in the DNS of 23rd December 2018, we have discussed about the overall environmental review which was provided by The Hindu newspaper. And in this it was highlighted that half of the Great Barrier Reef in Australia is bleached due to global warming. So this could have been one of the most important example related to the impact of global warming on coral reefs. Further, in the DNS of 16 September 2018, a news article appeared and was discussed, which is that researchers dive into restore the coral ecosystems. And this was related to one of the initiatives to restore the coral ecosystems. Now, this effort of restoration of the coral ecosystems was being carried out by National Center for Coastal Research. And earlier, this National Center for Coastal Research had mapped the coral reefs of India from the year 2000 to 2005. And this study or mapping of the coral reefs was carried out in 4 important coral locations of India. And these are the Gulf of Kutch, Gulf of Mannar, the Lakshadweep Islands and the Andaman and Nicobar group of islands. And this study highlighted that only about 40% of the coral reefs of India are alive. And this is mainly because of the impact of global warming on these coral reefs. And accordingly, in the year 2005, an initiative was started for the restoration of coral systems in India. And this effort was started by the National Center for Coastal Research along with the Department of Science and Technology. So these restoration efforts of the National Center for Coastal Research were also covered in the DNS of 16 September 2018. And again in this video, the issue of coral bleaching was discussed in detail. Now in the DNS of 14th August 2018, 2 important previous year questions were discussed related to the coral reefs. And in this question, which was asked in the year 2012, it provided one of the important points that could have been used in answering this question. So if you read this question, it reads that the acidification of oceans is increasing, and why is this phenomena a cause of concern? So if you look at the second point of this question, it reads, the growth and survival of the coral reefs will be adversely affected. And you might be knowing that global warming is leading to increased acidification of the oceans. And one of the important impact of ocean acidification is that it can adversely affect the growth and survival of the coral reefs. So this provides one of the important points for the question that was asked in this year's mains examination. Again, in the DNS of 16 September 2018, the question that was asked in the year 2018 related to coral reefs was discussed. Now again in the DNS of 16 September 2018, the question that was asked in the preliminary examination of 2018 related to the coral reefs was discussed. So as you can see, in the preliminary examination of 2018, a question was asked related to coral reefs. And again, in the year 2019, in the mains examination, a question was asked related to coral reefs. So this highlights that even questions that are asked in the preliminary examination can provide a cue for the mains examination. Now what was already discussed in the DNS that coral reefs could survive global warming, it was also again discussed in the Focus magazine. And this issue also provided the example of impact of global warming on the coral reefs. And it highlighted the example of coral bleaching of Great Barrier Reef in Australia. And we note that the question that was asked in 2019 required us to provide the examples. So this could have been one of the examples that you could have used in this answer. Now again in the Focus magazine, an issue of ban on the sunscreens to save the coral reefs was discussed. And this ban was initiated by a country known as Palau in the Western Pacific Ocean. Now, this issue highlighted the impact of chemicals which are used by human beings on the coral reefs. So, in short, this issue highlighted the anthropogenic impact on the survival and growth of the coral reefs. Now, although this is not related to the question which was asked in the year 2019, such examples can be used in answering if the question required us to analyze the anthropogenic impact or the impact of human activity on the coral reefs. Further, in the mains compass, the pattern of questions which are being asked by UPSC related to the environment section were provided. For example, it provided the previous year questions of 2018 and also other questions which were asked based on different themes in the environment were also provided. Now, in this section, we provided some important themes for the mains examination of 2019. And in this, the important theme that was provided was the coral bleaching. And as you can see, a question was asked in the mains examination of 2019. Again, in the compass of 2019 of the environment and ecology, the coral bleaching issue was discussed in detail. And in this, the causes of coral bleaching were also discussed. So, three main points that were discussed which were related to the impact of climate change or global warming on the coral systems included the increase in seawater temperature. Secondly, change in seawater chemistry, and which is reflected in the ocean acidification process, which has been exaggerated because of the global climate change. And further, it provided another cause, which is the increment in the levels of sediment in seawater. And a change in the sediment level in the seawater has been witnessed because of change in the sea level water due to the global climate change. And all these points could have been used in the question that was asked in the mains examination. Now, again, in the compass, one of the key aspects that was highlighted was the geographical conditions which are required for the growth and survival of the coral reefs. And these conditions are strictly very important for the growth of coral reefs. Now, all these conditions which are required for the growth of coral reefs are adversely impacted because of global warming and climate change. And that is how you could have correlated the impact of climate change on the growth and survival of the coral reefs. And that is because the climate change and global warming impacts the geographical conditions which are essential for the growth of coral reefs. Now, for example, these coral reefs are known to grow best in brightly lit water which are about 5 to 10 meters deep. Now, as we know that the sea level can keep on changing, and if that happens, this ideal condition of depth of 5 to 10 meters of water can be impacted. Further, suspended particles interfere with the feeding. So the requirement for the coral reef growth is that there should be sediment-free water. And that is particularly the reason why coral reefs are not found in the deltaic regions of major rivers. So for example, in case of India, coral reefs are not found near the Sundarban Delta. And that is mainly because of the sediments which are brought by the rivers. And these sediments choke the coral polyps which are important for coral reef growth. Another important condition is the ideal temperature which is required for the growth of coral reefs, and that is 21 degrees Celsius. However, if the temperature decreases below 18 degrees Celsius, it can cause the death of coral polyps. Now, as we know that another condition for the growth of corals is that the ideal temperature of the water in the ocean should be around 20 to 21 degrees centigrade. Now, due to global warming, if the temperature of the oceans rise, this condition will again be violated. And that is how that will also be one of the impact of global warming. Again, we know that ideally the coral reefs grow at about 5 to 10 meter depth in the oceans. That is why they are found in the coastal areas of major continents. And that is, they are found as fringing reefs, barrier reefs, and as atolls. And since the ideal temperature required is 21 degrees Celsius, majority of the coral reefs are distributed in the tropical areas where such kind of water is found in the oceans and the seas. Now, some of the points that were discussed in the DNS focus and the mains compass could have been used in answering this question, and a possible answer structure could have been this. In the introduction part, you could have depicted a correlation between the global warming and its impact on coral reefs. And this relationship could have been established based on any important study which was published in the past 2 to 3 years. Secondly, in the body of this answer, you could have highlighted the ideal conditions which are required for the growth of coral reefs and as to how these conditions are affected because of global warming. Besides this, you could have provided examples of coral bleaching across the world, and one of the important examples could have been the coral bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef. And in the conclusion, you would have provided some of the efforts that are being undertaken to restore the coral reefs. However, you would have highlighted the need to implement the Paris Climate Deal in letter and spirit in order to reverse the phenomena of global climate change due to anthropogenic activity and the CO2 emissions. So after looking at this answer structure, let us look at these points one by one. So a sample introduction could have been that climate change is the greatest global threat to the coral reef systems. And scientific evidence now clearly indicates that Earth's atmosphere and ocean are warming, and that these changes are primarily due to greenhouse gases derived from human activities. So this establishes the relationship between human activity, which has led to global warming, and ultimately it is impacting the coral reef ecosystem. And in the body of this answer, you would have explained this relationship between the impact of global warming on the coral life systems. And this relationship between the impact of global warming on the coral life systems has been highlighted by one of the important studies which was undertaken by UNESCO. And this study was related to the impact of global climate change on its World Heritage coral reefs. Now, after providing the introduction, you could have drawn this flowchart to highlight the relationship between global warming and the death of zooxanthid algae, and this disrupts the symbiotic relationship between the coral reefs and the algae, and which ultimately leads to coral bleaching. So this flowchart directly highlights the issue of global warming and its impact on coral reef ecosystem. That is, it leads to the death of algae, which is in symbiotic relationship with the corals. And that is how coral bleaching takes place. And after this, you should have highlighted the geographical conditions required for the growth of coral reefs and how global warming impacts these geographical conditions. So after this, let us take up the body part of this question, and in this part, we will try and explain the impact of climate change on the coral reefs and how the climate change impacts the geographical conditions which are required for the survival and growth of coral reefs. Now, according to IUCN, about 33% of the reef building corals are threatened due to climate change. And it further says that the climate change is equivalent to change in characteristics of the ocean, and it can be termed as ocean change. Further, increased greenhouse gases from human activities result in climate change and ocean acidification. So these two facts establish the relationship between the climate change and how this climate change is impacting the characteristics of ocean. So after this, let us look at the impact of various changes in the ocean on the geographical conditions which are required for the survival and growth of coral reefs. So for example, the warming of oceans and the increasing temperature of the ocean waters can lead to thermal stress in the coral polyps. And accordingly, this can lead to coral bleaching, and also it increases the infectious diseases in the coral reefs. And it impacts the growth of algae. And due to these infectious diseases, the algae starts dying, and which is one of the reasons of coral bleaching. Secondly, sea level rise can lead to increasing sedimentation in the coastal waters, and accordingly this leads to the death of coral polyps and again threatens the survival of coral reefs. Further, due to climate change, the changes in the storm patterns have been witnessed, and some of the tropical cyclones and storms have been more stronger and have been frequent in number. Now, what this increasing frequency and the strength of cyclones does is that it disrupts and destructs the structure of the coral reefs. And again, this is one of the impact of increasing frequency of the cyclones on the structural integrity of the coral reefs. Then because of climate change, there can be changes in the precipitation patterns. And in regions where there will be increased runoff of fresh water, more sediments from the land will get into the ocean or the coastal waters. And as we have learned that low sediments is one of the key conditions which is required for the coral polyps. So due to the increasing sedimentation, it can lead to the death of the coral polyps and will also increase the algal blooms, which is the increase in growth of unwanted algae in the coastal waters. And that also impacts the survival of coral reefs. Further, due to the climate change, the ocean currents in the ocean can also get altered. And due to this, there will be change in the connectivity and the temperature regimes of the ocean waters. Now we know that the ideal condition for the growth of coral reefs is the 21 degrees centigrade temperature. And if this temperature is altered or affected because of anything, and especially because of climate change, then the survival of these coral reefs will be at stake. Now we know that the ocean currents play an important role in the growth of phytoplanktons, and which is a food for different marine organisms. And as such, if these ocean currents get altered, there can be lack of food for the growth of algae and the coral polyps. And accordingly, this might lead to the death of the coral polyps and will impact the coral reefs. Now, one of the most significant effect of the global warming or the climate change on the oceans is the ocean acidification. And we know that the oceans are one of the biggest sinks of the carbon dioxide. And due to the increasing CO2 emissions, this CO2 gets dissolved in the ocean waters, and accordingly it changes the chemistry of the oceans. And how this changes the chemistry? So it reduces the pH and increases the ocean acidification process. Now, one of the important impact of this ocean acidification process is that it reduces the rates of calcification for the coral polyps. And due to this, the coral polyps are not able to create the reefs because of reducing calcification process. And that is why increasing ocean acidification impacts the structural integrity of the coral reefs. Further, increasing ocean acidification is known for increasing the disease growth in the oceans. And as such, it will also have an impact on the coral reefs. So in this, we have seen some of the important impacts of global warming on the coral reef ecosystem. And all these points could have been used in the body part of this answer. So after this, we will take up some examples which were required by this question. Now, as the question requires us to provide certain examples of the impact of global warming on the coral life systems, we could have quoted a report which was published by the UNESCO. And this was related to the UNESCO's World Heritage Centers which have coral reefs and what was the impact of climate change on such coral reefs. So this was the first ever global scientific assessment of climate change impact on the World Heritage coral reefs. And this highlighted that the northwestern Hawaiian island in the United States has experienced the worst bleaching on record with devastating effects. Secondly, the bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef in the year 2016 and 17 killed around 50% of its coral. And further, worst bleaching was ever observed at the iconic sites like the Great Barrier Reef, one of the locations in USA, the lagoons of Caledonia in France, and Aldabra Atoll in Seychelles. So these are few prominent examples of the coral bleaching that is happening because of climate change and global warming. Further, this report of UNESCO predicted that all of its 29 coral containing World Heritage sites would cease to exist as functioning coral reef ecosystems because of global warming if the global warming continues at a same rate. So along with the impact of global warming on coral life systems, we have seen that some of the prominent examples of this impact are visible in this report of UNESCO. Now, after seeing some of the correlation between the global warming and the coral life systems, you could have quoted some of the initiatives that have been taken place for conserving the corals. For example, there are global alliances and organizations like the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network, the International Coral Reef Initiative or the ICRI, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration of the United States of America are all focusing their attention on conservation of corals. Regarding the conservation of corals in India, these coral reefs are included in the CRZ1 or the Coastal Regulation Zone 1 and have also been protected under the Wildlife Protection Act. And further, India has a National Committee on Wetlands, Mangroves and Coral Reefs. So all these points highlight the initiatives that are being undertaken to conserve the corals. So these could also have been quoted in the answer. Now, as we have seen that despite various initiatives for the conservation of corals, the coral bleaching is taking place across the world. So you could have concluded by saying that the only way of stopping or controlling the coral bleaching is to implement the Paris goal targets. And we note that the Paris Agreement has given targets of achieving or limiting the global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial levels. And that is the only way in which the coral reefs could survive globally. And that is the only chance for the survival of coral reefs globally. So this could have been a conclusion. So in this discussion, we have seen the introduction as to how we have correlated the climate change with its impact on the coral reefs. Secondly, we drew a flow chart and which highlighted the overall issue. And finally, we looked at some of the points related to the impact of global warming on the coral life ecosystems and the geographical conditions which are required for survival and growth. And ultimately, we looked at some examples and also some initiatives. And we concluded that Paris Agreement implementation is the only way out for survival of the coral reefs globally. So this was one of the way in which you could have approached this question that appeared in the General Studies paper 1. And with this we conclude this discussion and thanks for watching this video.